I'm Al Filreis, and this is PoemTalk at the Writer's House, where I have the pleasure of convening three friends in the world of poetry to collaborate on a close but not too close reading of a poem. We'll talk, maybe even disagree a bit, and perhaps open up the verse to a few new possibilities, and we hope gain for a poem that interests us, some new readers and listeners. And I say listeners because PoemTalk poems are available in recordings made by the poets themselves as part of our Pen Sound archive, writing.upenn.edu/Pen Sound. Today, I'm joined here in Philadelphia at the Kelly Writers House in our Wexler studio by Rita Barnard, whose books include The Great Depression and the Culture of Abundance, and Apartheid and Beyond, South African Writers and the Politics of Place, The Cambridge Companion and Nelson Mandela, 2014, which she edited, and has been at work, and maybe you can update or correct me on this, on South African modernisms, plural, and post-apartheid cinema, who serves on many editorial boards. In her time on the faculty at Penn here at the University of Pennsylvania, has brilliantly served in directing roles for comparative literature, the Gender Studies, Women's Studies program, and the Alice Paul Center for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality. And by M.C. Kinniburgh, an archives broker and rare book dealer at Granary Books, which we revere, Granary Books, who specializes in 20th century and contemporary poetry archives and the art and artists' books, whose book Wild Intelligence, The Politics of Knowledge and Post-War American Poets Libraries, University of Massachusetts Press, 2022, explores the idea of the Poets Library as a political act of countercultural knowledge production, and who is also the publisher of TKS Books, a small edition imprint that specializes in artists' books and hand-detailed bookmaking. And by J.C. Cloutier, like Rita, a colleague of mine here at Penn, whose books include Shadow Archives, The Life Cycles of African American Literature, 2019, which has won a number of awards. Congratulations, JC, and a comprehensive volume of Jack Kerouac's original French writings called Directly from the Kerouac Archive after years of transcription and reconstruction, and has co-edited with Brent Hayes Edwards an edition of previously unknown novel by Claude McKay, and whose many interests include comics and cinema and various aspects of the beats, which led him here into this studio to talk about Kerouac's Old Angel Midnight. What a fun session that was back in 2018. Reconstruct that session. Who was Clark Coolidge with us?
Absolutely.
Was that amazing?
It was one of the highlights for me, definitely. Yeah.
And he read one of the sections. He read the first section, I think.
Yeah. No, it was amazing. Michelle Taransky was with us, too. It was a beautiful session. Yeah.
That's great. MC, your first time on PoemTalk and your first time inside the Kelly Writers House.
It's magical here.
Thank
you for having me. I feel it.
And,
Well, everything's in bloom out front.
And not only that, but the Writers House today is doing a marathon reading. And so everything is, there's a thematic snack associated with the book. And Rita, hi.
Hello, Al.
This is your first time?
My favorite colleague.
Oh,
but
you got to say that so everybody can hear.
32 years to invite me.
Well,
since
PoemTalk that long.
Yeah, how long has it been since
but
PoemTalk
still,
has
we
been
did
up?
it.
We did it.
Okay.
Maybe a session on Kenneth Fearing before too
long.
long.
Do we have any recordings of Fearing?
Well, I have a beautiful trained actor who reads Fearing.
Okay, that is a deal right here on the air. Zach is nodding like, okay, Fearing. I love Fearing. You know I love Fearing.
Fearing is one of
Fearing's
our
amazing.
Poet in a garret. He's precious in America.
You can get the actor to record for us. We can get the rights to that, and okay. All right,
Done.
Let's do it. Well, I'm so glad about that. That's great. Today, the four of us have gathered here not to talk yet about Kenneth Fearing, but to talk about a poem by Gregory Corso. It's called Vision of Rotterdam. It records or remembers a moment of encounter and reflection that took place in September 1957 and was performed and recorded in 1969 at Fantasy Studios on Natoma Street in San Francisco, 1969. A recording that is included, among others, at Pen Sound's Corso page. So here now is Gregory Corso performing Vision of Rotterdam.
September 1957, summoned by my vision agent via ventriloquial telegram, delivered by the dumb mouths stoned upon Notre Dame, given golden fare and 17th century diagram, I left the gargoyle city, and 2 suitcases filled with despair arrived in Rotterdam. Rotterdam is dying again. Steamers and tankers unload an awful sight. May 1940 stevedores lead forth the platoon of leukemia. Pleasure ships send metal-voiced rats tee-heeing a propaganda of ruin. A cargo of scream deafens the tin horn of feeble war. Bombers overhead. Young blonde children in white blouses crawl in the streets gnawing their houses. The old, the sick, the mad leave their wheelchairs and cells and kneel in adoration before the gentle torpedo of miracles. Bombers unanswerable to the heart vitalize a Sunday afternoon dream. Bombs like jewels surprise. Explosion, explosion, explosion. Avalanche on medieval stilts brought down 1940. Mercy leans against her favorite bombardment and forgives the bomb. Alone, eyes on the antique diagram, I wander down the ruin and see, amid a madness of coughing bicycles, the scheme of a new Rotterdam humming in the vacancy.
We don't typically on PoemTalk straighten out the dates and the narrative and get the context. That's not our approach, but I think we should do that today here. So we have 2 dates, 1957 and 1940. So we have an era of Reconstruction, and then we have, of course, the time of the Nazi army not only invading, but bombing the heck out of Rotterdam in May of 1940. Okay, so why, J.C. Starr, why does this poet arrive at a city that's been largely reconstructed and think about May 1940? What's the point of that? What's the vision?
Well, he has a vision. I mean, he's actually in Amsterdam, not in Rotterdam, in September 1957. He stays there about 2 months. He's coming out of Paris, the gargoyle city, Notre Dame. And
he got summoned by a vision agent saying, you better come to the Netherlands.
Right. And
why?
Well, in part, he had cashed some bad checks, and he wanted to get out of town in Paris. He was kind of on a hideaway.
Sounds like Gregory Corso.
And right,
he was on the lam.
See?
He was. He wrote some letters to friends, and he was like, "Well, I got to bounce. Cashed some checks on the black market. And got a scoot for a little bit until it dies down."
Yeah, and he was communicating. I mean, he's writing this to Allen Ginsberg and some of his friends. He's writing a lot of letters in those that time. I think he planned to do it, but the timing of the departure, I think, is due to the black market check affair. Yeah.
Okay, so now that gets us 1957. He flees Paris to go to the Netherlands. Well, let's just say it's Rotterdam, because it's actually Amsterdam, but he puts Rotterdam, and the Battle of Rotterdam in World War II makes this juxtaposition of time more poetic, I suppose. But so not May 1940. So that Rita and I, let's just stipulate, we are the non-Corsoians, for the moment anyway. Okay, so what does a poem do when it's taking the present day and going back to an awful moment, a moment of utter destruction? What's the point of doing that, do you think?
I was wondering if the poem is almost like pseudo-historical. Of course, when we read, we're going to home in on those dates, September 57 and May 40. But in a way, I see this poem as more future-oriented in a way. The idea of, summoned by the vision agent.
Very beat in that sense.
Exactly. And one might remember, I'm not like JC, an expert on the beats, but I thought there was something interesting about Corso's idea of what defines a beat. And he said, in the end, it's really a vision of what is to come. In other words, a certain kind of affective temporal structure or attitude that defines the beats. And I think that's how I would see the effect of this kind of visionary palimpsest that is the poem. Because, we do have those two 20th century dates, but we also have the antique diagram and so on. But I think in the end, that idea of the new scheme is what the poem attempts to put forward.
I love this. MC, let's turn to you. So we have what Rita calls, did you say faux history? Or I can't remember what the phrase was. Pseudo history, which is to say, you didn't quite mean it that way, but that's the phrase. I like that. May 1940 is a devastating moment, but clearly, as we listen to Bombers Unanswerable, this is the Cold War, 1957, the end of it, and Reconstruction is still at issue. We're becoming skeptical. Generally, people in Western Europe and the U.S. are becoming skeptical, and Japan, skeptical about Reconstruction. And the future is one of bombers overhead. And this is a poet who cared about the bomb. So help us with that. Am I wrong in that long second stanza? We begin to think of the present, even though we were instructed to think of May 1940? Bombers unanswerable to the heart?
No, I think that's very, very much what's on Corso's mind in the present moment. And this poem does really interesting things with place and time in that way. I think it goes for some literalness in terms of its history, because Rotterdam was completely destroyed and they had to build it back. And it was this kind of unprecedented chance to rebuild a city, which was what Corso was stumbling on. And generally, the rebuild, unlike most of American history, was somewhat viewed favorably, that folks thought in Rotterdam.
Yes, there were exhibitions, one called In the Near Future, 1947, another one called A City Rises Again, 1950. I mean, we did a little of that here in the U.S., even though there wasn't destruction, World War II destruction. Rotterdam builds. There was a ton of optimism. Only later in the 60s, and Corso has a 60s sentimentality or sentiment, even in 1957, do we become skeptical about the kind of aridity of the design and so forth. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, well, for Corso, I think generally speaking, you can't have future without deep past. And that's why it's not just 1940, it's a 17th century diagram. It's this summoned by a vision agent, which comes even before the diagram. So he's always advocating the poet's got to know their history. The subjectivity is not what's interesting to him. History, what can be known, is.
So, JC, he goes to a city that's been fixed up, cleaned up, and all he sees are bad. He sees bad things. Coughing bicycles. I would think we should be happy about all the Hollanders riding around on their bike. Isn't there a rat in here somewhere?
Oh, yeah, the rat's tee-heeing, which I love that line because the rat's tee-heeing in the program is very cartoony. He has a lot of cartoon comics references, and
so he sees all this cleaned up, and he doesn't believe. It's as if the Reconstruction took place, but never really sufficiently buried the awful past. And so we're looking at some kind of clean but horrible, nightmarish Reconstruction.
Did
I get that wrong?
No, I agree. And what strikes me about the poem when you do link it directly to the historical event it's referencing, the May 14th bombing, of the city, I think he must have seen historical photographs of the city from a bird's eye view, because there's the destruction photographs, but then there's also after the cleanup. And the cleanup, it's like the scheme of a new Rotterdam humming in the vacancy. When you see a photograph like that and you know this poem, that's the line that comes to mind, this kind of humming in the vacancy of what you see from this bird's eye view of this history. I almost feel like that was a conduit to a vision that he had. But over this, to use one of the words that Rita used, a palimpsest, he's kind of superimposing a potential new destruction that might be coming with the bombing threat again.
I'm so excited about thinking about post-World War II Europe from a beat if I may for a minute, ask us to take Corso as characteristically beat in the way he sees this. A beat read on European Reconstruction. What's that mean? Socially, politically, psycho-emotionally? How does one do that? A beat read on Reconstruction.
There's something about this vision of destruction that enables the vision of the new. And that's why I tend to want to say that it's not profoundly historical, because if it were, you would remember the people who died, you would remember, the action, you would remember history in a different way, I think.
He's not memorializing.
No.
But he is interested in the survivors. The old, the sick, the mad leave their wheelchairs. They're bowing down to the war machine, I guess. Kind of a nightmarish.
Yeah, but even in that line, there's this quasi-religious transcendence of, they kneel in adoration before the gentle torpedo of miracles. This is a, it's a redemptive incantation around this destruction. If it really was a poem memorializing this terrible bombing, if it were, it would be irresponsible, right? But
it would be responsible, not irresponsible.
I want to say irresponsible and unethical in a way.
Yeah.
But it is, that's why he's summoned by his vision agent, right? And so the destruction allows this vision of the new, the redemption, the transformation is foregrounded.
Okay, let's take it from there. Thank you.
Yeah.
So
I hope this isn't, too judgmental a view of the poem. Or
this is a Gregory Corso poem. Aren't we supposed to be judgmental? I mean, to say, MC, for Corso to come to Amsterdam, and say, it's dying again after all this reconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
That strikes me as, if not beat in particular, it strikes me as visionary romantic poet mode.
Yeah.
Right?
Or even just having a favorite bombardment. What's your favorite bombardment, Al Hamburg?
Right, that's right. I see a completely reconstructed relatively new NATO member, actually arming in a way they never had at the time. In 1940, they had almost no defense, right? And I see it, and all I can see is that it didn't work. They're dying again.
What is really interesting that JC pointed to is that this poem is, in its first kind of appearance, it is Amsterdam instead of Rotterdam. He writes to Peter Orlovsky, and he includes the first couple lines. And he arrived in Amsterdam, and he really dug Amsterdam. He liked it way more than Paris. In Paris, he was miserable and just writing letters about how broke he was and how everyone kind of stunk. And when he gets to Amsterdam, he's like, people speak English, they get it, they're on the beat thing. So I found it really interesting that
he would displace that to Rotterdam.
There's a switch, and it's because, like Rita's saying, this is a poem. It gets to be a poem. It's not history work, though it incorporates historical elements. It's supposed to transpose something that Corso is feeling about encountering this older history, older than American history, but American history is very much wrapped up in that World War II. It's that encounter of what he's feeling. And it's interesting that Amsterdam gets subbed out for Rotterdam. He's trying to pull his personal experience, I think, into a deeper historical arc.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And in terms of historicizing that moment, if we switch back to the 57 date and rather than just the 40, part of what's going on at that time, too, is the Howl is on trial. So, like, poetry is under attack, or maybe, we can see it that way. I do feel that there's a sense that these poets, the new poets, like America will know her poets by 1960, he says, like in one of the letters, and of this time. And I think he's thinking about that. He's writing to Ferlinghetti about, hey, how's gasoline going? Are you going to include this poem? Like, he's always asking about it. He knows he's on trial, and he's like, I hope everything's okay, but what about my book? But it's kind of an interesting exchange, but he's still thinking about the fact that the simultaneous bombardment is also taking place, I think, at the level of what poetry can do for us right now, and it's under threat, it's under attack, just as Rotterdam was at the time.
Young blonde children in white blouses. Okay, so there's an image of, hey, it's a nation that's cleaned itself up and has a new generation. Next line, crawl in the streets gnawing their houses. This is pretty skeptical. What do we do with this tone? What is the tone ultimately? Anyone?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but can I just admit that that's one of my very favorite lines, because of the power of the visuality of it. The image of a small child after a bombardment near their domicile or their house, gnawing their houses, the vision of teeth being bared lying on the ground, crawling, trying to get back to some kind of place where it used to be. The vision of that, by the combination of words that he's doing here, is extremely powerful. But I'm seeing it more as, I know we're framing it now as like this is a vision he's having about the 57 Rotterdam,
yes,
but it's almost like a kind of like a film negative superimposed on what he's both seeing the potential futurity, but also maybe seeing as his kind of power as a poet, rendering the visceral nature of what that must have happened to the living beings that were there.
That's so funny because when I brought up the line, I like your reading, but when I brought up the line, Rita, I thought he's referring to the present again. Mm. A new generation. I mean, sorry to generalize about the Beats, but in poem after poem, they're looking at post-war re-regularity, the Cold War culture getting itself back together and seeing the seamy underside of that. Obviously, this is a very obvious thing I'm saying about beat aesthetic. What's so attractive about this poem to me is that it goes traveling, which that's a thing too for the Beats, somewhat a kind of a brief self-exile or exploration somewhere else, and does the same thing at a civilization, Europe, that actually did cover over the sins of the past. There's a wonderful book by Walter Abish called How German Is It? And not really super relevant except for this. Book takes place in West Germany in the 50s or 60s, I guess the 60s, and a new town that has been completely built up over what was there before. They hadn't sufficiently investigated what they built the new town on. Turns out they built the new town on mass graves. And how German is it? This becomes a metaphor for the failures of European Reconstruction, which were sponsored in large part by the United States, by the Marshall Plan and so forth. So this is like, to me, and I'm probably overreading it, a critique of American ideas about Reconstruction.
I'm just pondering that line about the young blonde children in white blouses crawl in the streets gnawing their houses, and connecting it to Mercy leans against her favorite bombardment and forgives the bomb. So whose bomb? The German bombs? Is he, or the bomb to come?
The bomb. We would not have said of World War II bombing, the bomb. Corso himself would use the phrase the bomb. MC?
Yes. I think that's so wise to point at, because as we think of the children in this poem, I think of Corso as a kid and the completely traumatic upbringing he had, and also the generational trauma that the Beats had of coming of age when the atomic bomb was dropped. And with Diane de Prima, she writes about it, and she says you just cannot underestimate what that did to all of us psychologically. It made moving forward impossible. Poetry after Auschwitz, the whole premise of what people were going to do, grow up and be normal after that happened. And for Corso, I mean, what stakes did he have? He didn't even have an opportunity to play normal. He had a 6th grade education and was imprisoned because he had to steal to get by. So I think about some of the irreverence in this poem. I think about some of the bomb, and it's like he's coming from a really different place to write this, a really powerful place that resonated.
I really think we've gotten somewhere. I want to turn to JC and then to Rita. I really think we've gotten somewhere. I think that this poem could be said to be about that generational trauma.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Yes, absolutely. And there's a kind of the detritus of that past kind of swirling, but not just the World War II past, but as MC also said earlier, like going back to that 17th century diagram and Corso's penchant for also going into the deep past. And it's all swirling in there, but yes, in the form of a kind of trauma. But also, as Rita said, I don't think you can help read the ending as a kind of, there's a positive thing there, or there's the newness that is allowed or possible because of the destruction is still there. Now, whether or not it's going to be a new thing built upon something like a mass grave, as you just said, Al, is a different question. But there's an effort, as a lot of the beats had, to bring something beautiful into the world or different out of the trauma of one's own hardships.
And I think his poem, The Bomb, is...
I think it's called Bomb, isn't it?
Or Bomb is coming up
Interesting
shortly.
that the article isn't there.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Do you have...
No, I was just animated to have you bring that up because I think the lines you've pointed to about mercy and the sort of embrace of the bomb is what got him sort of in preliminary trouble or misunderstood with
Let's say he was
debut of
misunderstood.
Bomb.
Let's say he was misunderstood. Help us understand how he was misunderstood.
I think he was misunderstood, and
So tell us.
Ferlinghetti said as much later on. He said, "I didn't get what you were trying to do from the jump." I guess Corso's
But Ferlinghetti
idea...
published the darn thing, so
Well,
you'd think
you know.
he would have gotten it to some degree.
He did. He did get it eventually. The idea was that hating the bomb made you as bad as it, that one should love one's enemies. A philosophical approach to the bomb.
I want to go back to a couple things. One is the last line. You, a minute ago, suggested that it's a turn upward, possibly, that maybe this is an unironic new Rotterdam, right? That's the scheme of a really new one, not the new one that's been created here, but something else. Can someone explain why that might be read positively?
In the wake of what's come before in the poem, now, he's got the 2 suitcases filled with despair. Now he's alone. He still has the diagram. We don't know what else he still has. He's wandering down what's still a ruin, but the idea of a scheme of a new run, humming in the vacancy. The humming gives it a kind of vibrant potentiality that I see it very visually for some reason. Even though it's a reference to sound, I'm kind of stuck on this idea that he saw a photograph because when I see those photographs, I almost see them humming with a kind of possibility of what else might emerge out of the medieval stilts, right? In the sense that this fell down. This such an ancient city that has fallen down now. But now, what else will kind of emerge once more? And it could be, of course, the poet himself.
It's scaffolding. I mean,
Right.
potentially, the literal reading of that is, of course, scaffolding. And the scheme is the plans for what still had to be reconstructed, right? Just being simplistic here. The scheme, he's looking at plans. He's looking at probably one big block that hasn't been fixed up yet, that's still in progress in 1957.
He's also looking literally at the diagram, which is what's so weird about this last
So
stanza.
it's an old diagram.
Eyes on
He's also
the
looking at the
diagram.
current ruin.
I see. So
Right. We are constantly needing to destroy and rebuild. The design, the architect's plan, the engineer's plan of a new Rotterdam humming in the vacancy. That humming is, all the derricks and steam shovels, or those are 1950s words. In the vacancy, literally, I'm reading it literally. This is the open spot where you're building from down up. And that literal reading doesn't get me to a positive image. It gets me to, oh, these guys are still working on this. I don't know.
Maybe a different reading can arise if we, for a moment, ignore the visual power of the poem and focus on sound. I'm very drawn to, the metal-voiced rats tee-heeing, a propaganda of ruin, and a cargo of scream that deafens the tin horn of feeble war. Right? So there's an attempt to transcend or drown out the sound of war. I mean, World War II was not feeble, but here Corso is calling it a tin horn of feeble war with this, present activity, present affect, whatever, drowning that sound out. The tin horn of feeble war is in a way silenced so that the new Rotterdam can hum.
A new poetic, a new music, a new sound.
Exactly.
Oh, I like that reading a lot. I mean, so a cargo of scream is such a beat line. You take a noun, then you take another noun that doesn't work with a preposition in front of it, but you make it work. So scream becomes a general state, a cargo of scream. Either you hate beat writing like that or you love it. A cargo of scream deafens, and then we get another one of those with the preposition of having to do too much work. The tin horn of feeble war, capital W. And I assume this is a room full of people, at least at the moment, it would say this is what beat writing does. Can someone imagine a skeptic? Because those two lines are hard. Pleasure ships send metal-voiced rats tee-heeing, a propaganda of ruin, a cargo of scream deafens the tin horn of feeble war.
I am, in a way, the skeptic, which is why I said that I can sort of only handle the poem if I see it as visionary rather than historical.
And your reading just now helps that because you said that's a negative that becomes humming in the vacancy, which is actually a terrific phrase and not just a beat phrase, if I may. MC, what are you thinking about all this stuff about beat writing?
Well, I like beat writing. And
this is why we brought you
here. It's the stakes are so embedded in it. He shows up to this poem. He shows up to Rotterdam with everything he has, 2 suitcases. That's a lot of suitcases for Corso.
Filled with despair, another
with
beat
despair
line.
As opposed to poems, but they're probably poems of despair because he was notorious for always carrying around his writing in a suitcase and then accidentally losing it or accusing someone of stealing it. But he showed up with everything he had to this poem. And I think, Rita, your observation about the sound is pretty, if we were to code it, it's pretty negative. It's grating, it's jarring, it's uncomfortable. But there's some really beautiful images in this poem. Avalanche on medieval stilts is kind of an interesting visual. There's Jules' surprise for the bombs. So if you're just looking, it's not devoid of beauty. If you're listening, it's cacophony. And it sort of reveals a perspective that's torn in different directions. The beauty of destruction, but also just the intensity of encountering places when you travel. I even think of that. Like, he'd been in Morocco, and then he was in Paris, and he was traveling all over Europe. He must have been exhausted, and just there was a lot he was taking in at the time he was writing this.
I'm a little bit obsessed with Europe from World War II to this late 50s. It's the hobby horse of mine. So I want us to talk about Paris versus Rotterdam. Anybody want to take that up? Because he leaves Paris and he's not very happy about Paris.
I'll take it up to sort of defend my idea of the importance of sound. Paris, the gargoyle city, the gargoyles are dumb-mouthed, stoned.
Right.
And I love that. Like they're made out of stone, but they're also
There's a beat pun for you.
Right? It's really quite marvelous.
Stoned upon Notre Dame.
So Paris in a way is silent. Even though it delivers this ventriloquial telegram. So it's almost as though he's summoned, yes, by the vision agent, so the sights will be there, but also by the sound, the sonorities of the ventriloquial telegram, right? And then we do arrive in a city of sound.
A city that's underway, making its sound. Yeah.
Exactly.
Paris versus Rotterdam in the post-war beat imagination. Anybody else want to take that up?
Well, I mean, Paris is huge in the post-war. I mean, so he has this terrible time there. It's an up and down moment. Then hides out in Amsterdam, but he comes back to Paris and has a much better time. And then, Ginsberg and Orlovsky meet him in Amsterdam. Then they get the flu and they sleep on his floor for a while. And then
that's a famous moment. I've read about that.
And the intro to Gasoline is written
flu.
there. You can he signed. Ginsberg signs Amsterdam, 1957, right? So September, but then they go back and famously the Beat Hotel at 9 Rue Gilles Lecoeur in Paris, where they stayed for 2 years, and that's where a ton of stuff happens, and Burroughs comes and joins, and all sorts of shenanigans are born there. So it's very important and formative. This is just before that moment, but I think it's a Dutch agent who tells them about the Beat Hotel. So the connection is made there.
But let's do what PoemTalk does best. Let's imagine we don't know anything about that. We've got this poem, Paris versus Rotterdam in this poem. Let me toss out a thought, and you can respond to it. I'm sure I'm overreading. This poem needs a destroyed city that's trying to get itself together. Paris is not destroyed by World War II. Why? Well, collaboration for the most part, not by every French person, but officially.
So of course
they capitulated.
Yeah.
And, the Netherlands didn't exactly resist for more than 4 days, but they got destroyed because they fought back. And what we have now by 1957 is the perfect psychic location for Corso's thinking about repression, denial, forgetting, not facing. You build hastily on top of something, the stuff below, the shit below is gonna force itself back up, which is a kind of model for the unconscious itself. Paris doesn't have any of those problems. It turns out biographically to be a great place for them, but in this poem, you need Rotterdam is the real thing. All right, what do you think? You got to leave Paris if you're trying to explore this generational trauma that we're talking about.
Paris does give him the diagram, according to the poem.
Diagram, that's right.
The given golden fair and 17th century diagram, I left.
So he's given here, take this, the fair, I guess it's train ticket. Take this map and go to Rotterdam and find out what happened, what went wrong.
Yeah.
That's my reading.
I kind of think that's why they were traveling in part, too, because the places you go are sort of you need to check out this next, Not everywhere is the destination. That's the energy I get.
JC,
what do you think of my reading?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting reading.
I'm the host, so you're probably not going to be too mean
I'm
to
me, always caught up with the biographical stuff that I know. I know that the idea of Paris as the gargoyle city recurs all the time in Corso, like a dream of a baseball star or something. He talks about Ted Williams, hitting a home run on the Eiffel Tower, and all the gargoyles fly away out of the city of Paris. So he returns to that image in a lot of his poems and associates Paris with that. It's almost like the gargoyle is the one negative thing or something, maybe that he associates with. But
I thought he liked them.
You think maybe he likes them?
I don't know. In the letters, he's always like, "Oh, the gargoyles are pretty cool." It was the only thing he liked.
He's a bit gargoyle-like himself, don't you think?
Right. He's got some striking features. Yeah.
All right, let's go around twice more. The first time you're pointing out a line or a phrase that just needs to be in the record. And then we'll go around another time for final thoughts, sort of a general thought about this poem that you wanted to get into this conversation. So, MC, did I give you enough time to find a phrase or a line?
Ooh, I'm kind of torn.
You can do two if you want.
I'm going to say straight up the first line. I think we really need to pay attention to what each word is doing. In the sense, this is a poem about a knowable time, September 1957, and he's being honest about it. It's clearly revised after this, but this is when those lines start to come to him as a person in space and time, and summoned by my vision agent. I think that the visionary aspect of poetics for Corso was key, and he has a reputation as irreverent, as a joker, and he was all those things, much to our delight. But he was really compelled by visionary poetics. He felt he was in communion with time and history beyond himself. He was in dialogue, and I think that is embodied by other beats like Diane de Prima, and it's not a tongue-in-cheek thing. It is a genuine felt emotion. So I'm voting first line.
That's
putting that
great.
in the record.
And not only that, but you reminded us of the visionary poetic tradition that Corso is in. He's a sort of major player among those. We don't have too many. Let's pause and state American poets who can be called visionary or visionary romantics. Kenneth Patchen would be one. Whitman, I guess. Who else?
I had De Prima.
De Prima for sure.
Yep.
Ginsberg.
Ginsberg, right. Many of Corso's pals, for sure. Okay, thank you. That was great. JC, a line?
Well, there's many, but I do want to go back to maybe... it's tough to turn, but we didn't talk about the May 1940 stevedores lead forth a platoon of leukemia. It's another example of one of these cargo of scream, kind of, we categorize
platoon
as beat.
Platoon of leukemia, yeah.
Platoon of leukemia is a very powerful image as something that, weaponizing of a disease into a kind of militaristic language, but it's also the personification of the mechanisms of war that occur throughout this poem. It's the cargo of scream that is more powerful than the actual tin horn of something. So it's the leukemia. I feel it's the personification, the anthropomorphization, the reminder of the human element, even the mercy leaning on something. This kind of personification aspect. The lean in for Corso is to remind us of the human factor here, whether through a scream or a disease like leukemia that will linger in your body, infecting your blood. But I found those moments very powerful as images that remain in the mind. That's something that is higher than the mechanism of war, the machinery of war.
I'm glad you brought that up. And I do think that when I see leukemia in this poem, I was already predisposed to wanting to think about the bomb and radiation sickness and all that stuff that was not part of the 1940 decimation, which was not atomic, very much not atomic. It was, plain old, aerial bombardment and panzer divisions. Leukemia is a platoon of leukemia. It's as if the war still goes. And, of course, the pleasure ships full of people who are not aware of this horrible disease of a new kind of war, happy to spend their dollars because the dollar was so strong against European currencies, happy to do their post-war Americanization. And I think I really like the politics of this poem with respect to its critique of an aspect of the Cold War that most people aren't focusing on when they study the Cold War. Sorry, I've just riffed off, but I think that's a great line.
Absolutely.
Rita, a line?
Oh, I have the best one. Two, actually.
You can have two.
Bombs like jewels, surprise, explosion,
That's great.
explosion. And
that's great.
What I would like to emphasize is the way in which the simile does this work of transformation, right? So bombs, surprise, the poet tells us, like jewels. So there's I think lying there is this radical belief in the power of poetry to imagine, to redeem, to imagine some good coming out of something really terrible. So I'm a skeptic, But this is our visionary American romantic, right? Bombs like jewels, surprise, explosion, explosion, explosion.
Fantastic.
I love that. Can I just say, because the jewel surprise is such a visual thing, like
Exactly.
Christopher Nolan's like Dunkirk scene in Dunkirk, where they just come towards the camera like this. It's like that. These like the jewel surprise, the combination of that followed by the repetition, you can just almost feel it. You see it happen before your eyes, and how it explodes in all this, and catch the light in all these different ways.
It is an aestheticization in a way of war, but not like the futurists. It speaks to a different moment and to a completely different sensibility, a different future that has to be confronted.
Wow. This is great. I'm glad we did this round. I'm going to do one, okay? I'm obsessed with beat grammar, the beat sentence. And Ferlinghetti and Corso are the ones who do what I'm about to describe most often. And it can be very annoying in Ferlinghetti because he can go 12 lines, which is all a piling up of qualifying phrases that haven't gotten to the subject and verb yet. And you just like... And early Baraka does this, or Leroy Jones does the same. There are only two, that I can see, two first-person pronouns that have an active verb after them here. So the first one, you get all kinds of description. September 57, the date. Summoned, so I am summoned. Summoned via the telegram. Delivered. So all these, we're piling up the things that have happened. Delivered by, Stone, Notre Dame, given. I left the Gargoyle City. So feeling this state and this time, I left. Okay. The second time that happens is at the end. It's not much of a piling up, but we get alone. I am alone with my eyes. Alone, eyes on the antique diagram, I wander. Those are the only two times. The other times, we get all either passive or abstract or generalized grammatical subjects. Pleasure ships, sand. A cargo of scream deafens. The old, the sick, the mad, leave. Mercy leans. That's classic. The whole middle of the poem is classic Corso because the first person pronoun is the key here because that's the provider of the vision. But everything else becomes, I think, quite brilliantly a view of the cultural state of things. And it's not a Plathian I feeling it all singularly I-like. We do get that Ferlinghetti-esque piling up, but that's not what's so interesting. What's so interesting is that all these active verbs have things like mercy in front of them. So that's my thinking about the way he writes. And he does this pretty consistently, and this is a classic example of it. Okay, one more round, final thoughts. MC first. Something you came here wanting to say about this poem and didn't have a chance to yet.
Well, something I've realized through this wonderful conversation is for Corso, he has an interesting relationship with architecture. And I transcribed his lectures at Naropa when he was teaching there in 1980, and he does a history of Western Europe. And one of the most quotable lines was, "Poets make history, assholes don't." And the assholes in that quotation refer to the feudal lords and the people who were constructing, not the architects, but the people who were paying the money to structure Western Europe in the post-medieval era.
Wow,
so,
relevant to this poem.
Highly relevant. So that's something that continued to preoccupy him for the next several decades, indeed his life. But the idea was it's not just the architecture of a city that you look at. Poets make the history. So in this, at an early point in his writing, he's really enacting that. The poet makes the history. It will always be superimposed on a specific space, but poet makes history, assholes don't. So
I love that. That's so good.
Oh my goodness. I two thoughts. One is when we write the program notes, when we're about to release each episode of PoemTalk, we have a little tagline that's the title. And it's usually from the poem. but maybe that's what I'm going to do. Here's my second thought. It's a question. How many hours of Corso talking at Naropa did you listen to?
Several hours for the Lost and Found chapbooks, which was the occasion for the transcription. We only
CUNY
published
project.
2 lectures. Yeah, exactly, at CUNY. But I had to listen to him over and over because when he talks, he's very expressive and it's hard to get down what exactly he's saying. And he's got his catchphrases, like the whole shot, meaning like all of history, the whole shot. This is a shot. This is a shot. So a lot of Corso. His voice is super in my head.
So you have Corso in your ear.
Yeah, September. Yeah.
And how was the reading of this poem? Was that the Corso you'd been hearing from the Naropa tapes?
What a great question. It's Corso as poet. When he's a teacher, he is the court jester. He is the Schoep. He's the poet of oral tradition, guiding people, telling a story, pushing off criticism, running the room. This reading, I felt, was very somber and focused on the poem. And it's, of course, a decade or so after it was written in Fantasy Studios, which, had they done Creedence Clearwater Revival at that point yet? I'll save the rest of that. But the location, I think, is interesting for his reading, too.
I want to ask Zach to play a couple of lines from the beginning of this and then repeat the question to MC.
September 1957, summoned by my vision agent via ventriloquial telegram, delivered by the dumb mouths stoned upon Notre Dame, given golden fare and 17th century diagram. I left the gargoyle city, and 2 suitcases filled with despair arrived in
He's reading a poem here.
This is poet voice. Beat poet voice.
It's poet voice.
Corso.
My thing, by the way, is affirmed. Delivered by the dumb mouths. That's one. Stoned upon Notre Dame. That's another. Given golden fare.
It's oratory.
Yeah. And then there's no comma, but comma. I left. So he actually changes his voice to get to the subject and the verb. Yeah. So that's not the guy who was performing in the classroom that you listened to. Okay, very
he
cool.
didn't take any notes on what he was going to teach either, so I think that...
Not a surprise.
That accounts for a little bit.
JC, final thought?
Well, I'm so glad that we are talking about Corso, especially because, as you said, maybe there's not been that many occasions where people take the time.
Why not, by the way? What's the Corso reputation? And why did PoemTalk take 190 episodes before we got to Corso?
You tell me.
What do you think?
That's always been his own chip on his shoulder. I was published before all of them. All the stuff that he says about, Vestal Lady and all that. It came out before. On the Road comes out in September '57. And that will haunt him later.
He's competing with On the Road, yeah.
Well, he's not thinking about it that much then, but it's going to come and be a shadow kind of thing. And he's always seen as not part of the Holy Trinity or something, or there's some wound there, and the later years are embittered in some way, I think.
There's a lot happened in the 20th century. There's just a lot of work to do to chart out who knew what and give everyone their due.
You're such an archivist. But that's such a fabulous thing to say.
No, and it's a worthwhile turn to go back to Corso and spend a little bit more time with him. One of the lines from the letters I went back and looked at accidental biography just in preparation for this, and especially the letters from this time. And one line that emerges again even more powerfully after this conversation is to Ferlinghetti. He writes, "If poetry is going to make any sound possible, it surely will come out of injustice." And it just feels like something that he would agree maybe with a lot of what we're said here, precisely in terms of what we said about history, injustice, sound, what poetry can do, what it can still do for us.
Well said. Thank you so much. Rita, final thought?
Okay. He might not have been on the road, but this is a journey poem. I left the city, I arrived in Rotterdam, I wandered down the ruin and sea right? So I just wanted to flag that there's that kind of traveler's trajectory to the poem. And I was wondering, especially looking at that last verse paragraph or stanza, whether our American romantic visionary isn't here thinking perhaps about Blake. I wander down the chartered streets near where the chartered Thames does flow. Maybe there's a little echo here,
Oh, we
at
forgot
least
to
in
put Blake on our
spirit
list before.
of Blake's
Well, you said
London.
American visionary.
Oh, I did. Sorry. Yeah. But no, you're totally right. You're totally right. It's almost a quotation, really. That's lovely. Okay. My final thought, it has nothing to do with the poem. Well, it has a little bit to do with the poem. It's this thing in Rotterdam. I mean, I've always believed, I'm not an architect. I don't know that much about architecture, but a mentor of mine used to say architecture is destiny, which is probably too strong a way of putting it. But, the built environment, the human-built environment, suggests almost everything, suggests how we live, how we feel about spaces that we're in. And I just wanted to note that Rotterdam went through a whole bunch of phases where it realized that the charmlessness of the initial, very modern, very post-war kind of spare reconstruction, not, total destruction is, after all, an opportunity for architects, developers, and capitalists to build new stuff, right? I mean, so-called urban renewal in this country didn't have a war to cause that to happen. It's more straightforwardly evil, I think. But there it was a necessity, and so it was done in a charmless way. And then people, as I mentioned earlier, people in the 60s began to say, this is ruining the way we think about our spaces. And so they added things like, I'm sure, flowers and yards and gardens and maybe some trees and things like that. And they actually took down some of the buildings that had been expensively designed and built in the 50s. But all along, and this is the point I want to make, and it's not really a final word about the poem, it's more about Americans think about Rotterdam. The fire boundary, that's the line that traced the extent of the area destroyed by the German bombardment in May of 1940, is marked out to this day in the city. We have a fire boundary. And somewhere in there, in this poem, is that kind of vision. Rita, help me with this.
Well, I think this is visionary urban renewal.
There you go. Yes, and the presence of a fire boundary, which is a reminder that no matter how much you build, you cannot completely forget and repress.
Yeah, they should carve this poem on that wall in the city.
Now we're talking.
Okay, well, we better get the next flight over to Rotterdam and advise this. Well, we like to end PoemTalk with a minute or two of Gathering Paradise, which is a chance for us to spread wide our narrow Dickinsonian hands to gather a little something poetically good, to hail or commend something that's going on in the poetry world or the art world or the music world or film or TV or something. Who's got one? Rita.
I have one. When I was ill and I was too tired to hold up a book,
That's tired.
I looked on my iPad at William Kentridge's Charles Eliot Norton lectures. And I really just want to recommend them again. This is a few years ago, but this is performance art. This is something really, really rich. And Kentridge now has a new venture in Johannesburg. And I love this idea. It's called the Center for the Less Good idea. So you can apply with an idea that's not so great, but then it gets, if Kentridge likes it, it gets workshopped and it becomes performed and so on. So I just think that idea of, a center for the less good idea, we can take, all poets can take with them.
What a fabulous recommendation. I love that. JC, can you top that?
No, I can't top that. But I've been, I feel like a frivolous one. I've been enjoying the new Bob Odenkirk show, Lucky Hank, because I'm always curious when like an actual premium TV show is going to center around an English department these days, and he plays like the chair of an English department.
Though,
yeah,
right?
It is, but it's an interesting show.
Thank you. MC.
So to be beat adjacent and to be extra keen, if I may, TKS Books has co-published with Argos Books the selected works of Mary Norbert Cordy. We are so stoked about this. She's known as the Beat Nun because she hung out with Jack Spicer at the Berkeley Poetry Conference in 1965. And she was a nun. She was a Dominican nun and then left the order to live off the grid in the Redwoods up in Willits, California. And she's written poetry her whole life. She passed away last year, but Iris Cushing, who's the co-editor of this, she and I have put out this book of Mary's poetry, and she's spectacular. So I want to recommend something that I have published, which is the keen part. But I think Mary's work is really outstanding, and I hope more people will get into it.
Fabulous.
That's great. What's the title?
It's called Jumping in the American River. Selected poems. Yeah.
How many poems were available to select from?
Several books worth.
Okay.
Several books worth. So this is volume 1, in fact.
Fabulous. Beat adjacent sounds.
The Beat Nun.
The Beat Nun. I love that. Give us a word about Granary. Just say something for people who don't know this crucial and stellar project, what they should know.
Granary Books was founded by Steve Clay, who is really the heart of it. And we focus on small press, Mimeo, poetry, really. And in addition to representing literary archives, specifically poets, we do a lot of documentary work around the small press scene. So we publish, we place collections at libraries, and we spend a lot of time thinking about poetry.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. My Gathering Paradise is a poet by the name of Jeremy Dixon, who is Welsh. He's from Wales. And Jeremy's had a bunch of jobs. And one of them was at a well-known pharmacy chain. And this book is called In Retail. I'm going to read one of the poems. Good morning. Thank you for waiting. No one's answering the bell. They're all at a meeting without me. Seems I'm the only one left in the shop. Do you have an Advantage card? And would you like a bag? Please enter your PIN. Good morning. Thank you for waiting. No one's answering the bell. They're all at a meeting without me. Seems I'm the only one left in the shop. I couldn't find myself with a riot on my hands. Do you have an Advantage card? And would you like a bag? Please enter your PIN. Morning. Thank you for waiting. No one's answering the bell. They're all at a party without me. Seems I'm the only one left in the ship. I could find myself with a riot on my hands. Yes, you're right. It isn't good enough, is it? Do you have an Advantage card? And would you like a bag? Please enter your PIN. Morning. Now morning is spelled Mourning. Morning. Thank you for belling. No one's answering the wait. And there's another party without me. Seems I'm the only one left in the world. I could find myself with blood on my hands. Yes, you're right. It isn't God enough, is it? Mother says contactless is Satan's kiss. Have you taken the Advantage? And do you need a nose bag? Please enter your pain. Jeremy Dixon, In Retail. Well, that's all the humming in the vacancy we have time for on PoemTalk today. PoemTalk at the Writer's House is the collaboration of the Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing, Penn Sound, and the Kelly Writer's House at the University of Pennsylvania. Thanks so much to my guests, Rita Barnard, J.C. Cloutier, and MC Kinniburgh, and to PoemTalk's director and engineer today, Zach Cardner, and to PoemTalk's editor, the same amazing Zach Cardner. Next time on PoemTalk, I'll be talking with Simone White, Henry Steinberg, and Wayne Kestenbaum about 2 song poems sung by Kenward Elmsley. This is Al Filreis, and I hope you'll join us for that or another episode of PoemTalk.